What's going on, guys? Alliance back, and today I have my podcast number 2. So recently on my YouTube community tab, I asked you guys, what are your biggest questions you have for me regarding the sequel trilogy? And it can be on any of the movies in the trilogy, just make sure it is central around that trilogy. And you guys definitely delivered with a ton of questions, so I'm going to go down my favorite ones I found. There's a lot of them here, so pretty much this video is probably going to be less than an hour. I'm going to try to make it less of an hour, but like it's going to be a pretty long video. So if you guys like my podcast and you'd like to see more, please want to like, subscribe, and turn notifications for more videos, and maybe even suggest a possible centric theme for the next podcast in the comments below. Now, like I said, guys, this is all just my pure opinion. And this video, like my previous podcast, is meant to emulate like an actual podcast. So if I make a mistake, it stays in the video. So starting now, if I have any issues, I apologize, but that's just the way it is. Also, my wife and daughter are downstairs right now. Sometimes they make like loud noises that will kind of emanate up to the mic I have on my camera. So I apologize for that. Now with that said, guys, let's just jump in, I guess. Okay, well, the first one we have from Felix. Next, Felix. Yes, that's his name. Sorry, Flexi Felix. And he says, for how long did Luke, Leia, and Han know Rey was a Palpatine? So this one is an interesting question because this actually hasn't been explained in canon. Now, pretty much the interesting thing about these questions have been more like lore-wise questions and less actual of my opinion. So when I asked you guys, specific questions, it was more supposed to be from like my personal opinion of things, but this is actually like a lore question I could have looked up. So when I had a lore question, I looked it up, and this one actually isn't answered yet in lore, at least so far at the time of this recording. We will probably get a book in the future that will explain this more, but for right now, when it comes down to it, we don't actually have an explanation to this. Now, although we don't have an explanation, we can kind of give like a at least like a thought process on this. I think that The Rise of Skywalker alludes to the idea that Luke knew that Rey was a Palpatine from the very beginning. But I like the idea of maybe he found out when he became a Force ghost, and he and Leia actually talked about it. I think that kind of makes more sense to why like you don't really hear anything about it in the previous films, and it gives more justification why it does it kind of comes out of nowhere for Episode 9. So I like the idea that he found out after, after his death or something along those lines, and then him and Leia discussed it. Because if you think about it, Luke came back as a Force ghost in Arc 2, but I'm pretty sure he probably talked to Leia at some point, and Leia just kind of kept it a secret that she talked to someone, or maybe she didn't. I don't know, but I'm gonna guess that's probably when. That's like if Disney came to me and said, hey, can you come up with a reason, I would just come up with a reason that he didn't actually know that she was in Last Jedi, and so that would be that. But I think they actually said in the movie that they did know all along. But you know what? I don't agree with that yet. So until the canon reason comes out, I'm just gonna go with the fact that Luke found out after death and then told Leia. All right, next one is from Krazy Borscht. Sorry about that. The name slaughtering. This is gonna happen a lot. This is the usual. He says, was Snoke his own entity with his own Force sensitivity, or was he just a host body being possessed by Palpatine from a long distance? Yeah, so that's exactly what it was. Snoke was. We were led to believe that Snoke was his own person, and he isn't. He was just a puppet for Palpatine. Now, I actually predicted that Snoke was actually initially going to be the actual puppet master behind Palpatine this entire time. This was back before he died in The Last Jedi. But it turns out the roles were switched. Palpatine was actually using Snoke as a puppet. Now, whether that was supposed to be in there since the very beginning, I don't think so. I actually think it because Rian Johnson killed off Snoke, and JJ needed that big bad guy. He decided to bring Palpatine back as kind of like a nod to the fans, but also as a pretty simple explanation onto like what's going on as far as that character goes. So that is the answer for that. He was just Palpatine's puppet, and he could control him from a long distance. This new trilogy set up this idea that the Force kind of is more expansive than just like a certain distance. And I think that's interesting. I mean, we kind of saw that before, but this is like, you can, light years away, you can control someone, you can talk to someone. And that's crazy to kind of introduce, because while in like the Clone Wars, if you guys watched the TV show, which the majority of you probably had in the past, like the Jedi are super powerful when it comes to combat, but their more intuition type of force powers are not as incredible as this. So when we get to the sequel trilogy, and you know, Rey's using this life heal thing, where I shouldn't say, it's not like a force heal. It's definitely like she's using her life force to heal the people, like, or to rejuvenate people. She can do that, and you know, Snoke was able to, you know, combine the minds of Rey and Kylo, and he was able to have them talk to each other through the Force. And I think that's something that you don't really see in the previous films, because the previous films dealt more with, like, you know, how the Jedi can react to fighting and stuff like that, and less of how the Jedi can, you know, use their more intuition to, you know, pursue their future with their Force abilities. So I think in a way I appreciate it, but it is cool to have, like, the prequels, you know, Jedi being able to jump around and, you know, have like these massive cool like lightsaber battles. So I understand the switch in the Force, because as the Jedi died, you know, the more of the idea of, you know, these constant lightsaber fights and stuff like that kind of died with them. And so these new Jedi, or Rey's Jedi, I guess you could call them, they're more like intuition based. And I guess you could even say like Luke kind of started this type of change. Like, he wasn't really a combat oriented Jedi. He was more of an intuition type of Jedi. So it's interesting. But it was fun to have like the Jedi being able to, you know, be everywhere fighting and stuff like that. Okay, next one we have from Dark Jedi, and he says, I have a question, although I probably know the answer. If you could have chosen one director to direct the entire sequel trilogy, would you choose Rian Johnson or J.J. Abrams? And then he said he would choose J.J. Abrams. Okay, so for me, I think the biggest thing is I don't necessarily care who the director would be. I just wanted one director for the entire trilogy, or maybe not even like one director. I just wanted one person, one central, you know, caretaker of this entire trilogy to kind of be there and making sure things line up. I said this in my previous videos, a bunch of videos in the past, and it's definitely spreading across the internet now, but sorry, that was my phone. I'm going to turn this on airplane mode for a second. I don't need this on. Anyways, sorry about that. The thing about this trilogy is that, you know, it was missing the roadmap. It was missing that person to be able to keep all the stars aligned. And personally, he asked between these two directors, while I like JJ, and this might sound bad, like people are probably gonna get mad at me for this, but I think that I would really like to see how Rian Johnson would have done all three of these films. Because while if you guys don't know, I actually think Last Jedi is one of the worst Star Wars movies. It's one of the best movies as far as quality, in my opinion, but it's not supposed to be Episode 8. So I think that if he could have made his own universe with his own characters and kind of pursued that storyline in a way that he wanted to, I think Episode 8 would have been very good if it wasn't Episode 8. So I would actually like to see his own trilogy, and we're still getting one, so we can actually see like how he can do his own thing with that. From a visual standpoint, The Last Jedi is probably the best looking Star Wars movie we've ever seen, so I have to give it credit for that. So in the way, I don't mind JJ's trilogy. This is kind of like JJ's trilogy, although he didn't write part 2. I did want to see that Rian Johnson, I think that if he had his own trilogy like we're going to get, but if he wrote this sequel trilogy, I think that people would be more satisfied with it, because he wouldn't have to be doing these different twists and turns with characters he didn't necessarily care about. And that was the issue with this one. So I guess if I had to choose between the two of them, we already kind of saw what JJ was going for. And, you know, while depending on if you like The Force Awakens or not, for me, I just kind of found it subpar. And not that it was bad, it was just kind of okay. And while The Last Jedi was definitely not a good Star Wars movie, I think the biggest issue with that is because those were not his characters he was playing with. You know, he was playing with someone else's toys. You know, he was at the jungle gym. You know, in the sandbox. And J.J. Abrams, he left to go get lunch, and Rian Johnson's like, oh, I'm gonna play with his toys. And then he broke some of the toys. You know what I mean? And that's the issue here. So, like I said, I would prefer either one of them. I don't necessarily care who would do it, but I would like one of them to control all three films instead of trading off. And that's one of the biggest problems with this film. If the biggest issue with this entire trilogy is that the story didn't have a roadmap, the second biggest issue is that not only did it not have a roadmap, it had two storytellers. You know, at least with George Lucas, regardless of what you want to say, if you don't like his directing and, you know, you don't like his dialogue, he was the guy telling the story. You know, he was the main storyteller, and that's why the first 6 films, regardless of if you like some or you hate some, they are cohesive. They feel like they go together. They feel like they are like poetry. You know, they rhyme. And, you know, and it feels like that. So that's the issue with the sequel trilogy. The sequel trilogy feels like it's not part of that rhyme. It's kind of like its own rhyme, you know? And I don't know. I just think that's, for me, that's a pretty big misstep. So, yeah. All right, next one is Parker, and he says, do you believe the sequel trilogy introduced too many new force powers, making characters seem too OP? And he says, for examples, Rey bringing Kylo back to life, Ghost Yoda using lightning, Palpatine extracting force power from Rey and Kylo, and Rey using the force to take down a spaceship. So, like I mentioned earlier, the majority of, like, the Jedi in the past, they were much more combat-oriented. And then these new Jedi that we were seeing in the newer sequel trilogy, and even some of Luke's abilities, like I said in the original trilogy, they are adding this idea of, you know, more, like the force powers aren't necessarily meant for combat. They're meant for, I guess you could say saving people, less than killing people. And that might just be based on the situation. You know, the Clone Wars, the Jedi were constantly at war. So, you know, their abilities would have to mold to the idea of, you know, being able to kill. Where the Jedi now aren't necessarily needing to kill, they're needing to rebuild, you know, needing to heal what they had. So I think in a way that kind of mirrors that idea. But I do think that there are some things that this new trilogy kind of went overboard with. So first off, Rey bringing Kylo back to life. The thing that bothered me about that was it wasn't necessarily explained super well. It was just kind of like, oh, she has this ability now. And I left the theater going, well, why didn't she just bring him back to life? Like, why did she let him die? And we don't really get that explanation, really, until you get, like, the writers answering questions about the movie afterwards, and then that's how you get the questions. Now, of course, all this stuff can be inevitably answered in the future in a comic book, or maybe a future movie even, or just a regular novel. But I took it as if she healed him, and I took it as if he healed her, and then, you know, he was already injured from the previous battle with Palpatine, and then just kind of died, and she could have, like, you know, brought him back. But the thing is that the actual lore reason is that she used the Force ability to bring her. He gave his life to her, essentially, and that's what happened. So it's an interesting concept, but I do think that's a little OP, but I'm more okay with that one. The one that gets me the most is, like you mentioned, the Ghost Yoda using lightning. That one is just, I don't know about that one. Like, that one is probably the biggest like issue in this entire series for me. The ability that a Force Ghost can just, like, launch a lightning strike from sky, because we don't know anything about these Force Ghosts, really. You know, like, why aren't they around? Why aren't they hanging out? You know, there has to be a canon reason for that. And like I said, all this stuff can be answered in the future, but we didn't get a reason for that. It would have been cool if maybe it was because Palpatine was still around, so he was using his dark side abilities to block out the Force Ghosts, which would make sense if they wanted to do that. You know, I would be okay with that explanation. But for this one, with that amount of power, he just summoned a lightning bolt from the sky. You know, why can't all the Force Ghosts show up and just do that to Palpatine like that, and that it's over? You know, Rey doesn't even have to sacrifice herself. So it opens like a massive like plot hole in the entire story because we haven't had any explanation. So as far as the rest goes, Palpatine extracting Force power from Rey and Kylo, you know, that's okay. You know, I kind of there's an ability called Force Drain in the older canon, or Legends, and I'm okay with that idea. And then Rey using the Force to take down a spaceship. I think her abilities, you know, she's kind of evolved ever since the first, you know, episode 7. And there's been this big mystery of where she got her abilities, where she got her power. The thing I will say is that the sequel trilogy, compared to what we've seen in the past, is that, you know, in the past we were shown that you kind of have to train along with your abilities. Like, your abilities don't just make you OP. But the sequel trilogy introduced this idea that your power is also combined with your ability. Now, they tried to explain this idea in like episode 7, how Rey could just use a lightsaber and just like kick butt with the Force and all that stuff. And Kylo was linked to them at the same, Kylo was linked to her at the same time in episode 7. But they didn't actually link up really until episode 8. But the idea is that, you know, if the light rises, the dark meets it. And that's kind of where they kind of, I wouldn't say retcon the idea, but they tried to solve that issue with that explanation. And I guess I'm okay with that. It's a different type of way of looking at the Force, but it's another one of those things, is that like an OP thing to be able to do that. Because now, if Kylo learns a new trick, Rey essentially learns it too. If Rey learns a new trick, Kylo learns it too. And we see that with even the Force healing at the end of, or the life Force healing at the end of Rise of Skywalker, how Kylo didn't heal anybody else, but he just kind of knew how to do it because he and Rey were linked. And so that's interesting how that goes. And I'm not necessarily 100% against it, but my whole issue was that, you know, the prequels and even a little bit of the originals presented the idea that with great power comes great responsibility. So if you're given all this power, but you haven't had, you know, the time, the technique, and the like abilities to like practice and learn that power, then you're just not going to respect it as much. So I don't know, maybe that's just me, but that's how I feel about that reason. Okay, next one we have from Rambo Reviews, and he says, did Palpatine win? No. Okay, he gives a little explanation to this. He says, because he told Rey to kill him and she will become Empress, and Rey refused, but 10 minutes later, she killed him. So I think the whole lightning thing was supposed to be reminiscent of the idea that Palpatine killed himself. So Rey didn't actually strike Palpatine down in anger. She used Palpatine to strike himself down. So that's what I took from it. But it is interesting because she goes there to kill him. He goes, hey, kill me, and then I will become you. And she's like, I don't want to kill you anymore. You know what I mean? And which I guess makes sense. I probably won't want to be, you know, taken over by a Sith Lord like Palpatine. That would kind of stink. But yeah, that's kind of the way I see it. That's okay. So I mentioned this before in my other videos too, but I want to kind of throw this in here. So when it comes to like perceiving something, it's all about how you view it. So sometimes you look at specific things, and if certain things aren't explained, you'll be like kind of let down because you're like, well, what happened here? Why is this? What's going on? The best way that I perceive this new sequel trilogy, and it makes it better for me, is to change my perception on the entire idea of the sequel trilogy. Because yes, for me, the sequel trilogy is not nearly as good as the prequels or the originals, but there are some pretty good aspects that are actually in the films that you have to admit. And I just changed my perspective on a lot of the different type of situations going on. And the best example would be with Rey at the end. So the idea is that like Rey, she sacrifices herself to kill Palpatine, right? So in a way, if you want to change your perception on the entire situation, Rey does technically kill Palpatine with his own power. However, she does get the final kill. So even if you want to see it as, you know, she did kill him, in a way she died too. So if Palpatine would have gone into her, he would have died then. Like, that would have been the end of his soul, right? So when Kylo comes back and brings her back to life, in a way, Palpatine dies right there. So Palpatine doesn't survive in a way, because then she comes back as herself and not as Palpatine. And that might sound weird. I know that. And in a way, it doesn't really make any sense. But like I said, if you want to perceive specific things that way, I think it does become a better story if you perceive, you know, the storylines that certain way. But yeah, that's just my opinion on that. Okay, next one we have from I Am Viking, and he says, what do you think the new canon meaning for orange lightsaber crystals will be? Okay, so this is the specific, I think he means, yeah, so it's kind of like a point of debate. People are debating if Rey's lightsaber was orange or yellow. And I actually thought it was more yellow. And if you look at like the screen caps of that type of stuff, it looks yellow, like that scene. So regardless of what it means of orange and yellow, I think that's supposed to be like representing the future of the Jedi. You know, the Jedi are initially seen as blue and green, but the future isn't going to even matter about lightsaber colors. I think red might still be saved for the bad guys, because yeah, you gotta do that. But I think the representation of the yellow was the joining of green, which is the light side, and the joining of red, which is the dark side. And that's, you know, if you take red and you take green, they make yellow. So that would be my representation of that entire situation. Or like I said before, my previous question, that's what I would take as my perception on that scene, because there'd be no other reason for her to pull that out at the time. She just kind of pulls it out and like, that's a nice lightsaber, I like that, you know. And she doesn't need to be doing that. So if you're going to look at that scene or examine it, that's the best I would say. Okay, next one we have from, oh man, I'm gonna butcher this name. I'm sorry, but I'm gonna butcher your name. I already know. Abdulaziz Al-Jafari? I'm sorry. I don't know how to say that name. You know who you are. So he says, why don't they tell us anything about Snoke and his story? Okay, so I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I'll go a little deeper into this. So the reason why they don't mention anything about Snoke's story is because in canon, while this First Order situation is going on, there's these like leaders all kind of fighting over controlling First Order. And actually, I think Hux's father was one of these leaders trying to, you know, fight for control of being the new, like, emperor in a way, or the new supreme leader. And Snoke just kind of shows up out of nowhere, kills them all. I don't think he kills Hux's dad, but he saves Hux's dad, and then later on Hux's dad dies, and then Hux becomes like his, you know, lackey. And so that's kind of how like the story of Snoke is as far as what we knew. I think they were going to go further into the story before Palpatine got revealed as Snoke's, you know, puppet master. But that's an interesting concept, the idea that, you know, Snoke just kind of comes out of nowhere, and it leaves this like big idea out, because even if you watch The Force Awakens, you know, if you watch The Force Awakens, you're thinking to yourself like, where did Snoke come from? And that was one of the biggest issues with that film, and we didn't really get an explanation in The Last Jedi like we thought we were going to get. So that made a lot of people mad, you know, because he became a red herring. And red herrings are okay unless you set up everything to be specifically based off of this idea that there is something more going on with the character. Then you just end up making the entire fan base mad at you. And of course, Rise of Skywalker kind of fixed that. But when it comes to Snoke's story, in canon, he just kind of showed up, killed all the leaders, and said, I'm leader. And everyone's like, okay, you have Force abilities, so I'm gonna let that one go. So yeah, that's the reason for Snoke's existence. They also say the reason why Snoke looks as decrepit as he does is because Palpatine wasn't actually able to make a host body that could live or could like continue to stay like in one piece. So after a while, Snoke's body would just kind of crumble and die, and then he would have the next clone go in and replace that dead body. And so I'm sure there are some people in the actual Empire, or I should say the First Order, who actually knew Snoke's real identity. Like maybe a couple Sith loyalists were out there like replacing Snoke every like couple of years, you know, when the Snoke body just kind of dies, you know, or it's about to die, Palpatine will send another one to take its place. And then, you know, that's an interesting concept to do. So that's why we don't get much story on Snoke, is because, I mean, ultimately, I think the reason why we don't get story on Snoke is because, this is the real life reason, is because Rian Johnson killed Snoke in episode 8, and now J.J. Abrams brings Palpatine back and says, oh, Snoke was just a puppet for Palpatine. So that is the real life reason. Now, the in canon reason, as we know, is because Snoke was just a puppet for Palpatine. So that is the answer to your question, my friend. And like I said, your name is very, very tough to say, so I apologize for that. Okay, next one we have, another Rambo Reviews, and he says, why didn't Rey become Empress Palpatine after fulfilling... Okay, so I actually already did this one. Sorry, sometimes I have like repeat questions, so I already answered that. So thank you, Rambo Reviews. You got your answer answered. Next one we have from Creationary Bixby, and he says, who decided to let Rey be a Skywalker? Okay, so this is something I mentioned in one of my recent videos too. I like the idea of Rey becoming a Skywalker. I know a lot of people don't like this, but like I said, you have to change your perception on the situation. So the entire story, people were complaining about the idea of Rey becoming a Skywalker because they'd say like, well, the whole notion of what Leia was trying to teach Rey is that to not be afraid of who she is. And then she just doesn't want to become Palpatine and she wants to become a Skywalker. And people making points like, well, just because you're a Palpatine doesn't mean you're bad, and you should take that name as Palpatine and you should change it. And for me, I view it as this: if I was the son of Hitler, I wouldn't really want my last name to be Hitler, regardless of if we were two different people and Hitler was an evil man and I am not an evil person. Regardless of how different we are, the name, it still carries and it still represents something. So instead of me taking the name Hitler and then trying to change me into a good guy or something, or trying to change it so people perceive it differently, I'm just going to take on another last name that means more to me. And so this is my kind of explanation for this whole situation, this scene anyways. I see it as this. So Rey wants to, she wants to be accepting of who she is. And people are mad because, she was a Palpatine, she should just stay a Palpatine. But I like the idea that you choose your own fate. Rey chose to be a Skywalker. She didn't want to be a Palpatine, so she chose to be a Skywalker. It wasn't that she just took on the name because movie. You know what I mean? I mean, technically that is the reason, but like from a story standpoint, if you change your perception of that entire scene, she didn't want to be a Palpatine. She wanted to be a Skywalker, so she became a Skywalker. So while I understand people not liking this scene, for me, I think it's fine because in the end of the day, I wanted Rey to be like Luke's daughter anyways. So it kind of comes full circle that way. And also in a way she's paying respect to not only Luke and Leia as she sees them on Tatooine, but she's also paying respect to Ben. And Ben was her love interest for a couple minutes. So yeah, she's just paying respect to the Skywalker saga and continuing the lineage, even though she's not technically blood. So yeah. Okay, next one we have from I'm Better Than You, and he says, how do you think George Lucas's ideas would have panned out as a sequel trilogy instead of the real trilogy, assuming he had writers to aid him? Okay, so there is a lot of information on how George Lucas's story would have had it unfolded in episode 7, 8, and 9 if he were to have written them. For me personally, I think it would have been interesting to see where he would have taken 8 and 9. So let's say JJ makes episode 7, and then he decides to make episode 8 and 9, but instead of him actually writing the story, he brings George over, and he has George write the story. I think the story would have been great. Now, of course, JJ could change the dialogue to make it more snappy, make it more JJ feeling, but... Sorry, I have a train going by my house right now, you probably hear it. But when it comes down to like the Force abilities and stuff, I think that George would have kind of taken more care with what he was making because this is his world. Even if, like I said, JJ would have made episode 7, he would have taken episode 8 and episode 9 to places I feel like we should have gotten. For example, we definitely would have seen Snoke and Luke meet. They would have fought, probably lightsaber battle. Palpatine probably would have never came back. Snoke would have made it to episode 9 at least. And then Kylo would have teamed up in the end. Or actually, Luke probably would have been killed by Snoke to save both Kylo and Rey at the end of episode 8. And then by episode 9, Rey and Kylo would be like a well-oiled team. Or I should say Rey and Ben would be a well-oiled team. They'd be trained by Leia. And then the two of them would then go together to take down Snoke at the end of episode 9. Something along those lines probably would have happened. And then they would have had the example that I think that George would have actually taken the character of Snoke and made him Darth Plagueis. I know there's a lot of people who love that idea. There's a lot of people who hate that idea, but I think it ultimately would bring the entire story back into the fold, because Plagueis was a big deal for Palpatine in the past. So I think to actually make Snoke Plagueis, or at least make like Snoke not necessarily Plagueis, but maybe the puppet of Plagueis, or the reason why he looks so decrepit is because when Plagueis died, he transferred his soul into another being, and then as time gone on, he became Snoke, of course, and he got to where he was at. So I think we would have gotten things that we wanted to see more with George. Would have been better, though. Yeah, it probably would have been better. I'm not going to try to fight it. You know, I appreciate the sequel trilogy for trying a lot of new things, especially Last Jedi. I appreciate that film for trying new things. It's just they weren't always warranted. You know, they weren't always allowed to do those things, and they did them anyways. And it kind of takes away from the overall story for me personally. So I would love to see how George Lucas would have taken episode 8 and 9. Not necessarily episode 7. I like the idea of, you know, where JJ took the story for the beginning of the sequel trilogy. Like, for example, like episode 7, while I'm not like the biggest fan of that movie, I'm okay with where it was. There are some things I definitely change, but I'm okay with where it ended. I just think that like maybe, you know, episode 8 and 9 needed more, you know, George Lucas. So that's what I would say. Next one is from Michelle Tybel. I think I got that one right. And they say, or she says, why didn't Obi-Wan use Force Heal on Qui-Gon to save him like Kylo did to Rey? So this is one of those things I mentioned earlier. Jedi of the past were more for combat, I would say. And especially Obi-Wan was pretty young still. And I don't think they necessarily train people how to use life force, because in a way, I think that's kind of like an emotional ability to be able to care about someone enough that you can actually transfer, you know, your life force to someone. I mean, it seems like an emotional ability to do, and that would be my easy little retcon reason for why no one in the past could do it, was because the Jedi weren't allowed to have emotions. So the only Jedi who could essentially would have been able to do it was probably either Anakin, or maybe even Qui-Gon probably could have done it, but you know, they just never experimented with it because they didn't necessarily know they could do that. So I think that is what we are looking at there. Next one we have from Spidey's Gaming. He says, would it have been better if Anakin showed up to kill Palpatine instead of Rey? So I don't know if necessarily Anakin needed to show up to kill Palpatine. I initially predicted that Anakin was going to show up and have like a Force Ghost battle with Palpatine. This is before the film was actually out. But for me, I just wanted to see the Force Ghost show up, even if they're just standing there like, you know, there was this initial, at least this is some rumors, I don't know if it actually was a true thing, but there was this initial early scripts when Rey is, you know, blocking Palpatine with the lightning. I think she only has one blade at that time. The Force Ghosts show up, and all the Sith followers start trying to, you know, attack Rey from behind. And then all the Force Ghosts show up and kind of make like a shield and like, you know, like use his ability. And you have like Obi-Wan there, you have Mace Windu there, you have Yoda, you have Anakin. I don't exactly know why Mace would be there, but I mean, he's a Jedi in the past. He didn't really find a way to live throughout the Force though, like Yoda and Obi-Wan did. But he could show up. Who doesn't like Samuel Jackson? You know, bring him back. You know, Ahsoka would be there, and of course Qui-Gon and Anakin, they'd all be there, and it'd just be like them just helping out Rey in some sort, and instead of just kind of being there in spirit, they would actually legit be there in spirit, you know, and so I think that'd be a pretty interesting concept. I definitely think that this trilogy needed a little bit more Vader in it. I shouldn't say Vader, needed more Anakin in it. Yeah, and you guys already know, I've said this before in my plenty of other videos in the past, but I think that whole pep talk that Han Solo had with Kylo, that should have been Anakin Skywalker, in my opinion. While I love seeing Han, love me some Han, you know what I mean? that should have been Anakin talking to his grandson and being like, hey, look, man, you know, the sins of the past do not forgive the deeds of the present, but, or I should say the deeds of the present. Oh my gosh, I messed that one up. The deeds of the present, I made this quote up, and I forget it anyways. The deeds of the present do not forgive the sins of the past. However, Rey needs your help, and you need to come back. You're the only one who can help her. You need to do this. And of course, that would be kind of like Kylo's turning point. So while I like the idea of him talking to his father, I think if George Lucas could probably insert anything in that final film, he would have changed Han for Anakin. So that's how I feel. So the next one we have from August Eric, and he says, how did Rey make her yellow lightsaber? Okay, so this isn't actually explained in canon yet. I looked it up. I tried to find this lore reason. We don't know yet. We'll know probably soon. I'm sure there will be a comic book about this. But there's a theory that she went back to an old Jedi temple, or she went back to Ahch-To, and on Ahch-To, she actually found the yellow crystal. Or the yellow crystal was actually, she had it the entire time. She had it from... what is it? She had it from Ahch-To when she took the books. With those books was like a little box or something, and the crystal came with that. So that is the going fan theory for right now. But we'll probably get an explanation on that eventually. Okay, next one is from Wilhelm Kolosted. I think I got that one. That would have actually been perfect. He says, on a scale from 1 to 10, how bad were the sequel trilogy? Okay, so here's the thing. The sequel trilogy is not terrible. It's not great, but there are some redeeming qualities to it. It's the exact same argument I would make for the prequels. When people say that the prequels are awful, I'm like, are you kidding me? The prequels are not bad. There are definitely some glaring issues, but to call them bad, you're being an original trilogy supremacist. You need to calm yourself. You need to look at the films again and rewatch them. So sorry, my daughter is yelling up the stairs to me. Anyways, so she's still yelling. Okay, I think she's good now. Okay, so what are we doing here? Got distracted. Okay, so yeah, I couldn't say that they're bad. If you guys want to know my ranking of these films, the best I could do, I can't really say a specific number for these films, but if you want my ranking for all these movies, I actually had that video. I'll leave that link to that in the description below. I ranked all the movies from worst to best, so if you guys want to check that out, you have any, you want to hear my opinions on it, like I said, I'll leave that link down below. So I guess I'll just move on from that one. This one is from Jacob Chile, and he says, Net, do you think Finn should have been the main Jedi? I think we should have seen more of Finn explored. Finn doesn't necessarily have to get a lightsaber like, Rey does. But I definitely think that there was a misstep here because JJ kind of introduced the idea of him being Force sensitive. And then Rian Johnson didn't even mention it. And then in episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, he's back Force sensitive again. So that was just... the biggest issue with that whole situation was just, two cooks in the kitchen. Or I should say two chefs in the kitchen. There were a lot of cooks, of course, but there were two chefs in the kitchen. And one was day manager, one was night manager. And day manager and night manager didn't talk. Or night manager just disregarded what day manager was talking about. And day manager came back and was like, oh, you didn't even notice this. Oh, well, I've got to fix that now. So that's kind of what happened in that situation. Next one is from Nathan Wells, and he says, how do you feel about Disney changing the timeline from BBY to BSI, before Starkiller incident? I know I hate it, but would like to hear your opinion. Oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. I mean, it kind of bothers me that, like, the Disney canon, I mean, it always kind of bothered me that the Star Wars canon never really had, like, actual, like, dates for things. So before Starkiller incident, I didn't actually know that they changed that. That's weird. I mean, honestly, I never really cared for the BBY, like I said. So I would actually like an actual timeline thing. I remember like playing the Old Republic games, and it'd be like 2000 BBY, and it's like 2000 BBY. Like, what is the actual date recognition in canon? Because Yoda's not gonna walk up to Mace and be like, hey, did you hear about that one holocron from that old Jedi? And Mace is like, oh yeah, the one from 2000 BBY. And it's like, oh yeah, the one before before the Battle of Yavin. Yeah, that didn't happen yet. That's not going to happen for another 30 years. But that was pretty crazy, right? Yeah, that was insane. You know, it's like, I just kind of wish that if Disney is going to do something, you know, big like this, I guess you could count this as big. Just give us an actual, like, you know, canon timeline. That's just for the fans. Like, give an actual, like, in canon timeline, please. I would prefer that. Okay, next one is from RZXY Montage. He says, is Kylo a Force ghost? Okay, so this we don't actually know yet, but every other character we've ever seen disappear into the Force, Obi-Wan. I guess Qui-Gon technically got burned, so he didn't actually. They cremated him, but you know, Anakin got cremated. He came back as a Force ghost, and of course, Luke. You know, every person we've ever seen kind of. Oh, even Leia. Every single person, Force sensitive person we've seen fade away, came back as a Force ghost. So while we don't actually know if Kylo is a Force ghost, I'm going to go ahead and say yes, he is. All right, our next one comes from Jacob Chalili again. He says, do you think Palpatine would be in Episode 9 if Snoke was still alive? No. Like I mentioned, that's an example of, you know, two chefs in the kitchen, and JJ set something up, Rian completely changed it, and then JJ had to come back and explain how or why Rian changed it, and that's kind of how that happened. So that's the explanation to it. Okay. All right, so this one is from another Wilhelm Kolsted. Oh, I keep doing repeat people. Sorry, guys. I didn't realize how many questions or how many people I'm repeating here. Usually, I try to make it like 2 at most for each person at least. This was, I think I did like 3 or 4 of some of these people. So sorry for those who only put one question and get answered. So I apologize for that. I'll try to do better in the future. So anyways, he asked, can you tell us how you would have made the sequel trilogy? Okay, so I did in the past how I would have written Episode 7. I'm thinking about maybe doing my own episode 7, 8, and 9, kind of like a video. But I think what I'm just going to do is I'm going to take what Episode 9 established, and I'm going to do an Episode 10, 11, and 12. So far, I'm working on the Episode 7. Episode 7. My gosh. There you go, guys. This is a live video. I'm not cutting that out, so you guys get all my mess ups in this video. But I'm actually going to be working on my own idea for Episode 10, 11, and 12. And I'm actually working on Episode 10, and I sent an outline of Episode 10 to a friend of mine who loves reading, you know. And she actually thought it was really, really good. Like, she got it. She didn't think it was gonna be that great, and she was surprised. I sent her also an outline for Episode 11, and she said her mind was blown. So that's actually cool to hear. I mean, it was just me kind of just like, you know, messing around. But if I think that this person who you know, reads a lot of books and is super into that type of like dynamics and stuff like that, if she thinks this is an interesting story, then I should probably post it for you guys too. So if you want to see that, let me know in the comments below. Actually, vote up here at the top of the video if you guys want to see that type of video where I explain my Episode 10, my Episode 11, my Episode 12. Now, going back to Episode 7 through 9, I might just do that for fun, but I don't exactly know yet. So let me know if you guys want to see that too in the comments below. Maybe I will do that. Okay, so next one is from Eldon Niebecker, and he says, how in the living heck did Palpatine survive Return of the Jedi? Okay, so this is interesting because I actually do have, it's not particularly the canon reason yet. We don't actually have a 100% canon reason yet. We will get that in a book, like with many of these questions, but for right now, this is something that I found online, and it says that it's possible to say that the purpose of the ceremony, but the fact that remains that one of Palpatine's closest aides, a historian who studied Sith on his behalf, was convinced that the Emperor would return. He believed that the Emperor was dead, but his soul had remained, and that he would take on flesh once again. So this character was actually his historian, the guy who would look up, like, you know, Sith legends and do like all of this extra stuff that, you know, he would be in charge of all this stuff that Palpatine would be looking for, especially when it came to the Sith stuff. And so this historian, I actually don't have his name, but this historian kind got to the point where he knew enough about Sith prophecy and the past that he was able to predict the idea that Palpatine would come back. Now, the interesting thing about this is this was actually set up in a book before Episode 8 even came out, I'm pretty sure. If it wasn't before Episode 8, it was definitely before Episode 9. This book came out at least like a year and a half ago, maybe even 2 years ago. And I don't actually know the name of the book either. But in the book, he mentions this happening. So in a way, there is this certain idea that, in lore, there was a reason for why Palpatine came back. But I think that might have been more because the historian was mentioning that Palpatine could have come back, and he was pretty sure he would, but, then Snoke showed up instead. And so that was kind of like, the idea. So in a way, the historian was right. He called it before The Rise of Skywalker even came out. So pretty cool, little in-canon reason. So now it's not an actual reason for why Palpatine came back. We haven't gotten that yet. The most common going theory, there's two actually. One is that Palpatine was a clone, the Palpatine that got thrown into the Death Star reactor. He was just a clone. And the second theory is that when Palpatine got thrown into the reactor, his soul actually transmitted out. So when you see that like blue haze go flying out in Return of the Jedi, that was actually Palpatine getting out of there, or his soul at least getting out of there. So while his physical body was destroyed, his soul remained. And that's kind of where he eventually, went back to Exegol, found some Sith acolytes. They made a machine so he could bring his body back. So I think out of all the explanations, I'm okay with that one. I think that's the one I'm going to go with until we actually have a in-lore reason for that. Okay, next one is from Zoe Skywalker, and she says, do you like The Last Jedi because many Star Wars fans don't like it? Now, like I mentioned earlier, guys, if you want to hear my thoughts on these specific movies, I have that video linked below. It has a rank. There's my ranking down there, and I'm also going to post all my Star Wars movie reviews. So if you guys really want to get into, in my head and see how I feel about all of these films, if I hated them, if I liked them, things I loved, things I disliked, all that type of stuff, I'll leave those links to those videos in the description below. They're really good videos, so I recommend you check them out. Okay, this guy's, this name. Okay, Cryatim the Bic Pikachu. And he says, where was Palpatine's lightsaber? Yeah, I was kind of hoping, like, when Kylo and, or I should say Ben, sorry. By this point, when Ben and Rey go to face off with him, they both stand there with their lightsabers, and they got their blue lightsabers, like, let's do this. And then out of nowhere, Palpatine's like, yeah, no, and just kind of, starts taking the life force from them. I wanted to see a lightsaber fight. I thought it would be really cool to actually see something go down. I mentioned this in my previous videos. I keep saying that, but I mentioned this a lot. But I like when Rey and Ben are teamed up. I think it's cool. It's cool to see them actually fighting together. So I was looking forward to the idea of them actually taking down Palpatine together in a lightsaber duel. I initially thought that they'd fight him with a lightsaber duel, and then Rey was about to get stabbed, but then Kylo would jump in the way of the lightsaber and he'd get stabbed, and then she would then take Palpatine out. And then that would kind of be like the way that, he sacrificed himself to save her, redeemed himself, and then he become one with the Force. That's what I thought was going to happen, especially if Palpatine says, if you kill him, he becomes you, right? So my theory with that is that if Kylo would have killed Palpatine, then Palpatine would have won into Kylo, right? But then Kylo would have been already stabbed by Palpatine, so then Ben would have died anyways, you know what I mean? So that's an interesting concept. So then in a way, Palpatine also destroyed himself too. I thought that would have been cool, but that's what it is. So next one is from Sky Nerd Games, and he says, what are your thoughts on Rey and Kylo's Force Skype in The Rise of Skywalker? Because in The Last Jedi, Snoke was behind it all. Okay, so this was an interesting concept too. The idea of them being able to be connected through the Force. I was actually a fan of that in The Last Jedi, and then they just kind of expanded upon it in Episode 9, and it made for some really interesting and dynamic points in this universe. It does make me wonder if you can maybe teleport using that ability though, because if you remember, like they were fighting in like this Force ability, but let's say like if Rey needed help, could she reach through the Force and grab Kylo and pull him through, or vice versa. I'd like to see that kind of expanded upon, because that's like a teleporting ability, and that's like God mode powers for a Jedi. Imagine being able to, like you're at your command center. You know, imagine in the Clone Wars, you're at your command center, and then like Obi-Wan would be like, yo, Anakin, we need you. We're pinned down. We need you out here. And then Anakin would be like, all right, take my hand, you know, and then Obi-Wan would grab him and pull him right through, and then he'd be at the battle. You know, wouldn't have to even get on the ship, wouldn't have to prepare troops. Maybe he could even just keep pulling clone troopers through. You know, you wouldn't have to even, you know, resupply. You know, you could just keep pulling them through. You wouldn't have to bring in the big ships. So it's an interesting concept to kind of explore and see where this could possibly go in the future films. But the reason why it's still around is because I perceived it as this. I saw it as when Rey and Ben had that Force ability linked to each other, Snoke then died. So while that bridge was created, it was never destroyed. So even like Snoke built that bridge and then he died, right? But the bridge didn't die because in a way, if you want to view it as Palpatine was still alive, so the bridge is still there, or when Snoke died, he didn't have the ability to unconnect the bridge, and they don't know how to unconnect the bridge, so they're just constantly just connected. So I think that's an interesting idea to go with, and I think that makes the most sense for me. So that's what I'm just going to go with. So next one we have from Swift, and he says, why did Rey call herself Skywalker at the end of episode 9? Okay, so I explained this already, so you already got that answer. Because that's what she wanted to be, so that's what she became. Next one is from XJ, and he said, how did Finn pick up Anakin's lightsaber and fight like a pro when it takes many years to master a lightsaber? Okay, so there is a actual canon reason for this. People don't know this, but although Finn was a janitor, in his training days, he was actually one of the best melee duelists. Now, the counter argument to this is that, you know, to use a like electrostaff like we see in episode 7 when he's fighting his one stormtrooper enemy, to use that compared to a lightsaber is completely different. But as we saw, he did have some training with it in a way. You know, he kind of practiced a little bit on Takudana before taking on Kylo. So I'm okay with the idea that maybe he kind of just used his training from the past, and then he applied that to using the lightsaber, and then just kind of did his best against Kylo. So that's, and plus Kylo was weakened, so I think that's okay for me. That's my explanation for that. Maybe there is a more deeper lore information, but from my knowledge of lore, that would make the most sense. Next one is from Marwin Hisham, and he says, how did Palpatine survive the fall from Return of the Jedi? Oh, okay, so yeah, I already answered that one, so that's answered. Next one is from Nostalgia Dude, and he said, which new film is the most visually interesting to you? Okay, so I mentioned this earlier. Out of all 3 of the movies, episode 7, 8, and 9, while I think episode 8 is probably, you know, the worst in terms of Star Wars movie, when we're talking about visuals and maybe even, you know, everything that kind of goes into that film that isn't story related, it's so good. And that's just Rian Johnson, you know. I'm not a massive fan of Rian Johnson, but all of his films are just like visually stimulating. You know, everything is just so interesting to look at. So I have to give The Last Jedi. So while The Last Jedi is the worst of the Star Wars films for the sequel trilogy for me, as far as visually, it's the best looking one. Like I said, just my opinion, but that's how I feel. Okay, I got a couple more questions here, so let's see what I got. I was trying to make this under an hour. It might go a little over an hour. Yeah, it's definitely going to go over an hour, but that's okay. Next one is from Luciano, and he says, was the trilogy a waste, or are you glad it was made? Okay, so there's some different points I could hit on this, but I'm not going to take too long on this question. I'm glad that this trilogy was made because now Disney will never do this again. And what I mean by this is Disney is going to now make sure everything that they do is prepared before just kind of rushing into the story. Episode 7 was a good example of them allowing one person to make part 1 and then just not caring who was making part 2 and part 3. And just, there should have been the one overarching storyteller. And George Lucas was that for episode 1 through 6. And there should have just been one storyteller telling the story. You can have different directors presenting that story, but there should have been one storyteller. So thank God. If you want, regardless of if you hate this trilogy, the best thing about this trilogy is we'll never see one like it. So, like I said, regardless if you hate it or love it, you'll probably never see one that is so misdirected and misguided and just needing help. So, yeah, that's how I feel about that. Next one is from Meat Boy, and he says, how did Maz Kanata get Luke's lightsaber? Oh, okay, so this was actually answered in canon. So what happened was some scrappers actually found the lightsaber, and Maz came across it, and she bought it from them. So there you go. This was actually something that I mentioned that they should have said it in like episode 7. They could have quickly and easily answered that, but they didn't have an answer for it back then. And now, since in canon, it's been explained. So there you go. Okay, next one is from Battered Fish Brick Productions. He says, is Han a Force ghost or a memory or slash hallucination? Okay, so it's since been confirmed by the writers that Han was actually a Force projection of Leia. And while it wasn't actually Han's soul, it was Leia perceiving how Han would react to the entire situation. So if you're in that scene, it definitely seems like Han is a different character. And the reason for that is because he's not actually him. It's Leia using her last remaining ability. If you remember how like Luke used his Force projection and it was too much power for him essentially, and that's what killed him. Leia used her remaining Force ability to project herself as Han and talked to Kylo and kind of forgave him. So while it wasn't actually Han forgiving him, Leia knew that Han would forgive her, would forgive Ben if it actually was him. So she presented herself as Han. And in a way, not only did Han forgive her, not only did Han forgive Ben, but also she forgave Ben. And so Ben knew that. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Like I said earlier, kind of feel like that should have been Anakin's point to step in, but I'm okay with that. Next one is from Tent Saturn, and he says, what happened to Jar Jar Binks? You know, that's the biggest question of this entire trilogy, you know? That's the biggest question since the prequels. Where is Jar Jar? I want to see him show up at some point. You know, if you're going to kill off Jar Jar, you can do that. But I got to see him first. You know, I got to be able to see him. Okay, so that's just me. I think that Jar Jar is a very important character, not just because of his you know, his arc with Palpatine, but also because of what he represents. He represents the idea of not taking yourself too serious. And I just think that's what Star Wars needs the most. The idea of, hey, this is a movie meant for entertaining people. Just be entertained. And that's what Jar Jar represents. So that's why he's an important character. A lot of people are going to disagree with me, but it's just true. You know, that's not even me just saying that off my personal opinion. You know, that's just, everyone knows it. So next one is from Jesse Valicenia. I might have butchered that last name. And she or he says, what's your favorite sequel trilogy movie? Okay, so like I mentioned, guys, go check out my rank list. You can find that out. Link in the description below. Next one is from Joshua Kovich, and he says, might be a dumb question, but what is canon? People always refer to it, and I have no clue what it means. Okay, so makes sense. So some people don't know the difference between canon and legends. So canon is the actual main real story, while Legends / EU is the story that isn't actually in the canon. So, like, let's say that I'm in a hallway. Now, I actually take a right. Let's say, like, I'm in a hallway and I get a split like this. I went right. That is the real life way. I went right. Now, what if I went left? So if you want to look at it that way, that's probably a really easy way to explain it. So canon is what I did, and legend is what if I did this. So think of it that way. That's actually a really easy, simplistic way I just came up with. So you're welcome. Hopefully that answers your question. Next one is from Emma, and she says, why didn't Rey bring Kylo Ren back to life after he brought her back to life the way they could both live? Okay, so this one was interesting too. I kind of answered this earlier, but I didn't really go that full into detail with this. Okay, so my opinion on this whole situation, I initially was thinking like, wait, if they both keep dying and living, why don't like one heal the other, and then that one can die, and then you can walk a little bit, and then you can heal that one back, and you can just keep going back and forth, eventually make it to some place that you can actually heal. So what I was told, and I don't know if this is necessarily confirmed, but what I was told was that your life force is linked to inside of you. So like Leia was how Leia disappeared around the same time Kylo did was because Leia gave her life to keep Kylo alive. So then Kylo used his ability to then give to, or used his life force to give to Rey. And so then both Leia and Ben died because they were linked together. And Rey now has the ability, now has the life force of Kylo and Leia inside of her. So it's confusing. It probably needs a better canon explanation, but that is the going, I should say theory, but I think it was technically confirmed by one of the writers, but we don't actually know that until it's actually truly confirmed. So that's that answer. So the next one is from the guy, that one guy, Matt, sorry. And he says, why did they have Finn want to tell Rey something, then never tell her? Okay, so this was a big thing too. This was my whole thing. I left the film thinking that Finn wanted to tell her that he was in love with her. But this has actually since been confirmed by J.J. Abrams himself. He wanted to tell her that he was force sensitive. And after I put the, connected the dots, put it all together, I was like, oh, that makes sense. But it definitely should have been explained a little bit more. And apparently there was actually, there's like a 3-hour cut of this film. So about 30 minutes of this movie has been cut out. And that was one of the scenes that were cut out, was Finn actually kind of explaining to Rey, hey, I'm force sensitive and I don't know how to tell you. And that was that. So that was the reason for that. So I think I have maybe 3 or 4 more questions here. So this one is from Clara Ladone, and they say, or she says, do you believe that Rey's lineage is an okay substitution for not being trained at all for being... Okay, so this is interesting. Okay, this is a big point of contingency too when it comes to what we know about the Force. She's pretty much saying, is it okay to explain Rey's great power without her training because she just happens to be related to a Palpatine? I don't think so, but I also know that Luke was really powerful, and he was, Anakin's son. So, I don't know. The Force works in mysterious ways. I can't really say if I like it or dislike it because there's different things I like, there's different things I dislike, but I think this is probably something best kept for a separate video, just because this could really, we could go deep into this one specifically. So I'm gonna leave this at that. I'm just gonna say that no, I don't think it is a good substitution for an actual reason, but for what we've seen from the rest of this trilogy, I think it is, if that makes sense. So that's the best explanation I can give to you right now. I might have to do a video on that in the future though. So the next one is from J-Bits, and they say, how did Snoke know about Kylo and Rey's Force dyad thing, but not Palpatine? Didn't he link them together? Oh, that is actually kind of interesting. You're right. Because in the Last Jedi, Snoke tells them that he linked them. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine does mention something about them being... He didn't realize that they were being combined. But I think what it was... Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. So Palpatine knew that he combined he linked them, but he didn't know that he could actually drain both of them together to re-heal himself. And I think that was when he was like, oh, well, instead of me going into Rey, I'm just going to be me. I'm going to control the galaxy myself. And I think that's what he was going to do. Of course, then Rey said, no, boo-boo, and she stopped that. So that's the reason for that line that he made when he said that he was like, whoa, this, you guys are actually combined, because he wasn't saying that, he wasn't surprised that they were connected. He was surprised that he could actually grow his, hands back and come back to life through them. So that's kind of an interesting concept to explore too. Okay, like I said, we got 2 more, I think. This one's from Gary Jones, and he says, do you think the structure of the first 6 films left enough reason to even open up the story again? Because to me, they seem pretty self-contained. 7 through 9 feels like an extension. Okay, so this is an interesting idea too. I mentioned this earlier kind of, but yeah, episode 1 through 6 is its own story. And then episode 7 through 9 is kind of its own story too. So the best way I can kind of explain this is, if you think of it like this, if I wrote a book and it was good and it had a bunch of chapters and people really seemed to like it, and then I had someone else, like a friend of mine who can think similar to me but isn't me, writes the sequel to that book. Or a better example here. So let's say I'm writing a trilogy. This is probably the best example. I write the trilogy, which would be episode 1 through 3. I write that trilogy, and then I write the original trilogy. These two stories, regardless of which one I make first, those are from my personal mind, right? That's what I had created. Then I get a friend of mine who thinks similar to me to write the sequel, or the third one in that trilogy I'm making. And that would be episodes 7 through 9. So while they think similar to me, they have a complete different understanding to what makes episode 1 through 6 what they are. So when you make episodes 7 and 9, try to emulate what I make while trying to make your own thing. You get what you get from the sequel trilogy. So that's the best example I can make from that. So yeah, in a way, episode 7 and 9 kind of feels like its own part of like Legends, but it is supposed to be canon. So it's one of those sticky situations, you know. Some people really like them, and I just think that they dropped the ball in a lot of places. So that's just me. Could just be me, but I don't think it's just me. Okay, and I think we have one more here. Yeah, we got one more, and this one is from Kai P, and he says, "Do you think that Kylo Ren should have defeated Rey in The Force Awakens?" Okay, so this one is just talking about episode 7 specifically. I think that it would have made more a narrative sense to kind of present this idea that, you know, Kylo is stronger than our main hero. And then eventually, as the films would go on, you know, she would win. But it's interesting because it's kind of like a switch dynamic. Because instead of Kylo victorying over Rey in episode 7, he victors over her in episode 9. So it kind of shows that he has become a better fighter, even though he was injured in episode 7, and I understand that. It's interesting to kind of perceive that idea, because in episode 7, we get this hint that he is powerful, but in a way, he's also still weaker than Rey. Then episode 8 comes along, and they kind of seem like they're on par with each other. And then you get to episode 9, and Kylo actually beats Rey in a lightsaber duel. And I think part of that was kind of JJ answering the fans and being like, yes, sorry guys, I know that you were mad about episode 7 duel. I tried to make it as though, you know, he was hurt. And I think that kind of went over a lot of people's heads, or they just didn't kind of examine that whole reason. But he does kind of get his butt kicked in episode 7 a little too easy, in my opinion. But when I first saw that movie, it really did bother me that he got his butt kicked that bad. But he kind of rectified that with episode 9 when he shows that he actually outdid Rey. And it wasn't even like he wasn't like going 100% either. Like, he outdid her without going 100%. So that is an interesting concept to explore too. The idea that Kylo did beat Rey in a lightsaber duel, and Rey, he out-tired her. You know, he pretty much pulled like a Darth Maul with Qui-Gon. You know, they were both good fighters, but at the end of the day, Kylo was the superior warrior, and he just happened to make Rey get tired, like Kylo got, or like how Qui-Gon got tired against Darth Maul. She got tired, and it's just she lost. So that's kind of where that concept comes from. Oh, you know what? I missed one more. Okay, we got one more question here. Chris McBurney, he says, did Disney really not have a plan for the trilogy? I feel that they treated it like Lost. They just left a bunch of questions, followed by a second act that failed to answer any of those questions, and then left the third act to pretty much wrap up the story and answer all those questions. That's 100% happened. Like that's it, Chris. Like that's it. I mentioned this earlier in this podcast, but that is the biggest issue with these new films. They didn't have a roadmap. They didn't have the one person steering the ship. They had a couple different like captains, but they didn't have like I should say that like I mentioned about the kitchen. You know, they had a bunch of cooks. They had 2 chefs, but they didn't have like a head chef. You know, they didn't have the general manager there to make sure the chefs are, you know, keeping things on track. And that's the issue there. That's the truth. And like I said, the worst thing about this trilogy is that it feels very jumpy, and episode 9 was relied on to answer a bunch of questions that episode 8 should have answered. But the best thing about this trilogy is that we'll never see one this mixed up again. I'm not going to say bad, because there are a lot of good concepts to it, and a lot of people do like this new trilogy. And to a point, I actually really do like this new trilogy too. But there's a lot of parts that are missing. that could have been improved on, at least in my opinion. So I guess that is the end of this podcast, guys. I hope you enjoyed. This was a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but, you know, this type of podcast, this type of video isn't really meant for you to, like, sit here and watch me the entire time. I mean, you can. I mean, I got a pretty face and everything like that, but this whole idea wasn't necessarily meant because you're supposed to sit here and watch. You're supposed to turn on this video when you're driving to work. You're supposed to turn on this video when you're, you know, doing some chores. You know, you just sit back, relax, do something else, and listen to me in the background. That's how I like my podcasts. I don't necessarily like to watch them as much as I like to just have them on when I'm doing something else and I can hear them. So that is the reason for this podcast, guys. If you want to see more, please like, subscribe, and turn notifications, more videos. Like I said, if you have any ideas for like a future podcast I could do, let me know down there in the comments below. And with that said, guys, that's it. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys later. Peace.